How reading changes the way your brain thinks in English. Narrator Daniel. I used to think reading English was passive, something you do quietly, something that helps vocabulary, nothing more. I was wrong. Reading was changing my brain long before it changed my speaking. I didn't notice it at first. I still struggled to speak. I still translated in my head, but something inside me had started shifting. English sentences stopped feeling foreign. Ideas arrived faster. Meaning came before words. And one day I realized my brain was no longer learning English, it was thinking in it. Not because I spoke more, but because I read differently. If you understand English, but it still doesn't feel natural, this is the part nobody explains. Reading doesn't just give you words, it rewires how your brain works. Segment 1. Narrator Daniel. For a long time, I believed reading English was the safest way to learn. No pressure, no judgment, no mistakes anyone could hear. I read quietly and told myself that one day, speaking would follow naturally. But for years it didn't. I could read articles easily. I could finish books. I could understand complex ideas on the page. And yet, when I tried to speak, my mind slowed down. English still felt like something I had to translate, not something I could live inside. That confusion stayed with me for a long time. If reading builds vocabulary, why didn't it build fluency? If reading improves grammar, why didn't it improve speaking? If I understood so much, why did English still feel distant in real conversations? The answer came much later and it surprised me. Reading was changing my brain, but not in the way I expected. At first, reading works on the surface. You recognize words, you understand sentences, you follow meaning. That stage feels productive, so most learners stop there. They measure progress by how much they understand. I did the same. But something deeper was happening quietly underneath. Every time I read, my brain was being exposed to English structure, not rules, patterns, the order of ideas, the rhythm of how thoughts are built, the way information flows naturally in English. I didn't notice it because it wasn't loud. Reading does not announce progress, it installs it. I realized this one evening while reading a short passage. Nothing special, simple English. But as I read, I noticed something strange. I didn't translate the sentence. I understood it instantly, not word by word, as a whole. That moment passed quickly, but it stayed with me because it meant my brain was starting to process English directly. This is the first major shift reading creates. Lesson 1. Reading trains your brain to recognize meaning before translation. When you read regularly, your brain stops treating English as a code to decode. It starts treating it as information. That is the foundation of thinking in English. Most learners believe thinking in English comes from speaking more. In reality, it comes from seeing English used correctly thousands of times in context. Reading gives your brain that exposure without pressure. But here is where many people get confused. They read randomly, they read too hard, they read without attention, and then they wonder why nothing changes. Reading only rewires your brain when it's slightly challenging but still understandable. When your brain can follow meaning without panic, patterns start forming naturally. I changed the way I read. Instead of trying to learn new words, I focused on how sentences moved, how ideas connected, how English organized thoughts differently than my native language. That changed everything. I noticed that English often puts the main idea early. It clarifies first, explains later. It prefers directness over build-up. These patterns began shaping how my brain expected information. Without realizing it, I started predicting sentences while reading. That is another sign of brain change. Lesson 2. When you can predict what comes next, your brain is thinking in the language. Prediction is not guessing words, it is understanding structure so deeply that meaning feels familiar before it appears. This is why native speakers read faster, not because they know every word, but because their brain expects the flow. Reading gave my brain that expectation. Slowly, English stopped feeling heavy. Sentences stopped feeling long. Paragraphs stopped feeling crowded. My brain had learned the rhythm. But the biggest shift came later. I noticed that when I spoke, I paused less. Not because I knew more words, but because my brain had seen similar sentences many times before. Reading had filled my mind with ready-made patterns. This is something no one explains clearly. Lesson 3. Speaking is easier when your brain has seen the sentence before. When you read, you are storing structures, not memorizing them, absorbing them. Later, when you speak, your brain pulls from that storage naturally. That is why people who read a lot often sound more natural, even if they speak slowly. Their English is not forced, it is familiar. However, this only works if reading is consistent. Occasional reading helps understanding. Daily reading reshapes thinking. I stopped treating reading as study. I treated it as exposure. 10 minutes a day, every day. Not difficult texts, not grammar books, real English written for real people. Over time, I noticed a quiet confidence building inside me. Not confidence to speak yet, but confidence to understand faster, to follow ideas without effort, to stay present in English. That confidence matters because thinking in English does not start with speaking. It starts with familiarity. If you are listening to this and feel like English never feels natural, ask yourself one question. Do you read enough for your brain to relax in English? Not enough to learn words, enough to feel at home. In the next segment, I will explain exactly what kind of reading changes your brain the fastest and what kind of reading wastes your time completely. Segment 2. Narrator Daniel. Once I understood that reading was changing my brain quietly, the next question became unavoidable. Why did some people read for years and still struggle, while others seem to think in English naturally? The difference was not intelligence, it was not talent, it was not even time. It was a type of reading. For a long time, I read in a way that felt productive but did very little for my brain. I chose difficult texts, advanced articles, complicated vocabulary. I told myself that harder meant better. In reality, harder meant slower. My brain spent most of its energy decoding words instead of absorbing patterns. I understood the meaning eventually, but the process was heavy, stressful, mechanical. That kind of reading teaches you survival English. It does not teach you thinking English. This shift happened when I changed one rule. I stopped reading to learn. I started reading to flow. This is where most learners get stuck. They think reading is about collecting words. But reading that changes your brain is about building expectation. Your brain needs to feel safe enough to predict what comes next. That only happens when the text is slightly below your maximum level. Not too easy, not too hard, just enough that your brain can move without stopping every few seconds. This led to the most important lesson of my reading journey. Lesson 4. If you have to stop often while reading, Your brain is not learning patterns, it is fighting obstacles. I tested this by switching to simpler material, short essays, stories, articles written for general readers. At first, it felt like I was going backwards. But something unexpected happened. I read faster, I enjoyed it more, and my brain stayed in English longer. Enjoyment matters more than difficulty. When you enjoy reading, your brain stays engaged. When it stays engaged, patterns sink in naturally. Another mistake I made was translating while reading, even silently. I would read a sentence, then repeat it in my native language in my head. That felt helpful. It was not. Translation breaks flow. Every time you translate, you pull your brain out of English and force it to switch systems. That prevents deep processing. So I changed another habit. I allowed myself to not understand every word. This was uncomfortable at first, but it was necessary. Lesson 5. Understanding everything is not required. Understanding enough is. Native speakers do not process every word consciously. They process meaning. Reading should train the same skill. I learned to ignore unfamiliar words unless they blocked the meaning completely. Most of the time, they didn't. The brain is very good at filling gaps when pressure is low. As I continued reading this way, I noticed something subtle but powerful. English sentences began forming themselves in my head during the day. Not consciously, automatically. That is a sign of internalization. Reading had started building an inner voice in English. Not a loud one, a quiet one. This inner voice matters because speaking begins there. Another important change happened with grammar. I stopped thinking about rules, but my sentences became more correct. Why? Because reading exposes you to correct grammar repeatedly in context. Your brain learns what sounds right long before you can explain why. Lesson 6. Grammar is absorbed through exposure, not memorization. That does not mean grammar study is useless. But without reading, grammar stays theoretical. With reading, grammar becomes instinct. I also noticed how reading affected my confidence. Not confidence to speak yet, confidence to stay present. When people spoke English around me, I followed more easily. I did not panic when I missed a word. I understood the direction of the idea. That reduced fear. Fear slows thinking, clarity speeds it up. Reading was giving my brain clarity. One evening, I realized something that changed how I saw progress. My brain was already thinking in English in one place, while reading, speaking was still catching up. That meant the foundation was already built. If you're listening to this and wondering why your speaking feels blocked, ask yourself what kind of reading you are doing. Are you reading to prove something, or are you reading to let your brain relax in English only? The second kind rewires thinking. In the next segment, I will explain how reading directly connects to speaking and how to turn reading into spoken English without forcing it. Segment 3. Narrator Daniel. The moment I truly understood the power of reading was when I noticed its effect on my speaking without trying to speak at all. There was no practice session, no conversation exercise, just reading done the right way, quietly reshaping how my brain responded when it was time to talk. Before that, speaking always felt like creation. I had to build sentences from nothing, choose words carefully, arrange grammar in my head. That process was slow and fragile. One interruption and everything collapsed. But after months of consistent reading, something changed. Speaking stopped feeling like creation. It started feeling like recall. This is the hidden connection between reading and speaking that most learners never notice. When you read, you are not just understanding meaning, you are storing sentence shapes. The brain remembers how ideas are usually expressed, not as rules, as familiarity. Later, when you speak, your brain does not invent sentences, it recognizes them. This recognition is what reduces hesitation. Lesson 7. Speaking becomes faster when your brain recognizes patterns instead of building sentences from scratch. I noticed this during a simple conversation. Someone asked a question, a normal one. In the past, I would have paused, translated, organized. This time, the response came out with less effort. Not perfectly, not fluently, but smoothly enough to continue. That smoothness mattered more than accuracy. I began paying attention to what I had read recently: articles, short stories, essays. I realized that the phrases appearing in my speech were not random. They matched the structures I had seen many times while reading. Reading had quietly stocked my mind with usable English. This explains why many learners feel stuck even though they study a lot. They know words and rules, but their brain lacks ready patterns. Reading supplies those patterns, but not all reading connects to speaking equally. I made another important adjustment. I started reading out loud occasionally, not every time, not for long, just a few paragraphs a day. This changed experience again. Reading silently trains comprehension. Reading out loud trains coordination. Your brain already understands the sentence. When you read it out loud, you train your mouth to follow familiar patterns. That reduces the gap between thinking and speaking. Lesson 8. Reading out loud connects thinking to muscle memory. I did not aim for pronunciation perfection. I aimed for flow. I allowed mistakes. I kept moving. This mirrored real speaking better than any drill I had done before. Another habit helped even more. After reading a short section, I summarized it in my own words, out loud, one or two sentences, nothing polished. This forced my brain to reuse the patterns it had just seen. Reading gave input, summarizing created output. That loop accelerated everything. Lesson 9. Reading turns into speaking when you reuse meaning, not words. I did not repeat sentences exactly. I expressed ideas loosely. That mattered. It trained flexibility. Over time, this habit changed how my brain approached conversation. When someone spoke, I did not search for words. I searched for meaning, and the language followed. That is how native speakers operate. They think in meaning. Language arrives afterward. Reading had trained my brain to do the same. Another surprising change happened. My inner voice changed language. At first, I noticed it while reading. Then, while thinking about simple things, short comments, reactions, questions, English began appearing automatically. Not all the time, not completely, but often enough to matter. This is what people mean when they say thinking in English. It is not constant, it is contextual. Reading builds those contexts. I want to be very clear about something here. Reading alone will not make you fluent if you never speak, but reading changes how your brain prepares to speak. Without reading, speaking feels forced. With reading, speaking feels familiar. That difference changes everything. If you understand English but still struggle to speak naturally, ask yourself this: does your brain see enough English to recognize it as normal? 10 minutes of daily reading does more for thinking than 1 hour of occasional speaking practice. Because reading trains expectation, speaking uses expectation. This is why many learners feel a sudden jump in fluency after a long period of reading. It feels sudden, but it is not. The brain has been preparing quietly. If you want reading to change how your brain thinks in English, remember this: read consistently, read comfortably, read attentively, do not rush, do not translate, do not force output. Let your brain learn the shape of English. In the next segment, I will show you how to design a simple daily reading routine that rewires your brain without overwhelming you, and how to combine it with speaking in a natural way. Segment 4: Narrator Daniel. Once I understood how reading was feeding my speaking indirectly, the next challenge was simple but critical. How do you read every day without turning it into another stressful task that you eventually quit? Because most people do not fail at reading English due to lack of ability. They fail because the routine feels heavy. I failed many times before I got this right. I started with big plans, long articles, difficult books, strict schedules. Every time I lasted a few days, then life intervened, motivation dropped, the habit disappeared. What finally worked was not discipline, it was design. I stopped asking how much I should read. I asked how little I could read and still change my brain. The answer surprised me. 10 minutes, not 30, not an hour. 10 focused minutes. Lesson 10. Consistency beats intensity when rewiring the brain. The brain does not need long exposure to learn patterns, it needs frequent exposure. Short daily reading keeps English active in your mind. Long sessions followed by silence do not. So I built a routine that respected my energy. Every day I read one short piece, one article, one chapter, one story. I did not mix sources, I did not chase difficulty. I chose material that felt clear but slightly challenging. This is important. If reading feels tiring, your brain is working too hard. If reading feels boring, your brain is not working enough. The sweet spot is where you feel engaged but relaxed. I also changed how I read. I stopped highlighting words. I stopped writing notes. I stopped stopping. I read once smoothly without interruption. Lesson 11. Reading that changes thinking must feel continuous. When you stop every sentence to analyze, you break flow. Flow is what trains the brain to think in the language. After reading, I added one small step. I closed the text and asked myself one question. What was this about? Then I answered out loud in one or two sentences, not perfectly, just honestly. This was not a summary exercise, it was a bridge. Reading trains understanding, speaking trains access. That bridge connected the two. I did this even when I felt tired, especially then, because tired brains reveal habits clearly. If English still appeared naturally when I was tired, I knew the change was real. Over time, this routine became automatic, not exciting, not dramatic, just part of my day. And that is where the real change happened. My brain began expecting English daily. Expectation matters. When the brain expects English, it prepares faster, it switches modes easily, it stops resisting. That is when thinking in English begins to feel normal. I also noticed that my reading speed increased naturally. Not because I pushed it, but because my brain stopped translating. Translation disappeared quietly. Lesson 12. You stop translating when your brain trusts the language. Trust comes from exposure without pressure. Another important part of the routine was variety without chaos. I rotated content slowly. Articles one week, short stories another, essays occasionally. But I never jumped between topics wildly in one session. Too much variety confuses pattern learning. Consistency builds familiarity. I also avoided one common mistake. I did not read only English learning content. Learning material teaches rules. Real content teaches usage. I read content written for native speakers, simple news, blogs, personal essays that exposed my brain to natural English, not teaching English. That distinction is critical. Your brain does not need explanations, it needs examples. As weeks passed, I noticed a subtle shift. English thoughts appeared sooner. Responses came faster. Pauses felt lighter. I was not fluent yet, but I was no longer blocked. Reading had softened the wall between thinking and speaking. If you want to change how your brain thinks in English, remember this. Do not read to impress yourself. Read to normalize English. 10 minutes a day. One piece, one idea. Let English become familiar before it becomes fluent. In the next segment, I will explain why reading alone is not enough and how to add the smallest amount of speaking to lock these changes into your brain permanently. Segment 5. Narrator Daniel. By the time reading had reshaped how my brain processed English, one truth became clear. Reading alone was powerful, but it was incomplete. The changes it created were real but fragile. Without a small amount of speaking, they faded under pressure. This is where many learners make a mistake. They either read only and stay silent, or they force themselves to speak too much and burn out. Neither approach works long term. The key is balance, and the balance is smaller than most people think. I discovered that speaking does not need to be frequent to be effective. It needs to be connected to what you read. I added one simple step to my routine. After reading for 10 minutes, I spoke for 30 seconds, not a conversation, not a presentation, just a response. I reacted to what I read. I agreed or disagreed. I summarized one idea. That was all. Lesson 13. Speaking locks in what reading installs. Reading prepares the brain. Speaking confirms it. This short speaking moment trained my brain to retrieve English patterns under light pressure. Not enough to trigger fear. Enough to create access. I noticed that speaking became easier when it followed reading. My brain already held the structure. I was not searching for words. I was using familiar ones. This is why random speaking practice feels hard and connected speaking feels natural. Another shift happened. I stopped worrying about sounding advanced. When speaking after reading, I naturally used simple English, but it felt right because it matched the patterns I had just seen. Lesson 14. Natural English comes from repetition, not complexity. Advanced words do not make speech fluent. Familiar patterns do. Over time, these 30 seconds became the most important part of my day. They were short enough to avoid resistance, but powerful enough to create change. I also noticed that this habit changed my listening. When people spoke English around me, I recognized phrases faster. Not because I memorized them, because I had seen them many times while reading. Recognition replaced translation. That is the real sign of thinking in English. I want to address a common fear here. Many learners say, if I speak wrong English, I will learn bad habits. This fear is understandable, but incomplete. Bad habits come from repetition without input, not from imperfect output. Reading provides correct input. Speaking uses it. As long as you keep reading, your speaking self corrects naturally over time. Lesson 15. Input corrects output automatically. This is how children learn. They speak incorrectly while constantly hearing correct language. Their brain adjusts. Adult learners can do the same if input is strong. Another benefit of this reading speaking connection surprised me. My confidence increased quietly. Not because I sounded fluent, but because I trusted my process. I knew my brain was learning even when progress felt slow. That trust removed panic, and panic is the enemy of thinking. When panic disappears, the brain processes language faster. Everything is connected. Reading relaxes the brain, speaking activates it. Together, they create flow. If you want reading to change how your brain thinks in English, do not isolate it. Pair it with small, gentle speaking. 10 minutes reading, 30 seconds speaking every day. This is not a challenge, it is a system. In the next segment, I will explain how to maintain this habit over months without losing motivation and how to measure real progress without judging yourself unfairly. Segment 6. Narrator Daniel. The hardest part of this journey was not starting the habit, it was trusting it long enough to see results. Reading changes the brain slowly, quietly, and because there is no dramatic moment at the beginning, many people quit before the real shift happens. I almost did. There were weeks when nothing felt different. I still hesitated while speaking. I still paused too long. I still felt that familiar pressure in my chest when English came at me fast. That is when doubt appears. Am I doing this right? Is this even working? Shouldn't I be more fluent by now? These questions are dangerous because they focus on feeling instead of function. I learned to stop asking how English felt and start asking how my brain behaved. That changed how I measured progress. Instead of asking, do I feel confident? I asked, do I understand faster? Do I stay present longer? Do I recover quicker after a pause? Those are real signs of brain change. Lesson 16. Progress in language shows up as speed of recovery, not absence of fear. Fear may still appear, but it releases faster. Pauses still happen, but they do not end the conversation. Confusion still appears, but it does not paralyze you. These changes are subtle. You only notice them when you stop expecting perfection. I also learned something important about motivation. Motivation does not sustain reading, identity does. When I treated reading as a task, I skipped it. When I treated reading as part of who I was becoming, I returned to it naturally. So I changed the story I told myself. I'm not studying English, I'm someone who reads in English daily. That identity shift mattered. The brain protects identity. If reading is part of who you are, skipping it feels strange. If it is just a task, skipping it feels normal. I also removed pressure completely. If I missed a day, I did not compensate. If I felt tired, I read something easier. If I felt distracted, I read less. Consistency does not mean intensity, it means return. Lesson 17. The habit survives when it adapts to your energy, not when it fights it. Another mistake I avoided was tracking too many things. Words learned, pages read, time spent. All of that creates noise. Instead, I tracked one thing: daily exposure. Did English enter my brain today in a relaxed way? If the answer was yes, the day was successful. This removed judgment. Judgment kills habits. Over months, this approach changed how English lived in my life. It was no longer an activity, it was an environment. English was present regularly, without pressure. That presence mattered more than effort. One day I noticed something that surprised me. I started missing English when I did not read, not because of guilt, because my brain expected it. That is a powerful signal. Expectation means rewiring has begun. Another sign appeared in conversation. When I lost a word, I did not freeze. I replaced it. When I made a mistake, I continued. When someone spoke fast, I followed the idea even if I missed details. These are thinking skills, not language skills. Reading had trained my brain to move forward. I want to be honest about something. Reading did not make me fluent overnight. It made me stable, and stability is what allows fluency to grow. Unstable learners chase techniques, stable learners allow time. If you're listening to this and feeling impatient, understand this. Your brain does not change because you want it to, it changes because you expose it gently and repeatedly. The reading speaking system works because it respects how the brain learns. Small input, low pressure, high frequency. That combination builds trust. And when the brain trusts English, it thinks faster. In the next and final segments, I will bring everything together. I will show you how this way of reading changes not only your English, but how you approach learning and communication itself. Segment 7. Narrator Daniel. The deeper change arrived quietly, long after the habit felt normal. It wasn't about reading faster or knowing more words. It was about how my brain approached English before I even noticed it. English stopped feeling like a task. I didn't wake up thinking about practice. I didn't plan sessions. I simply expected English to be part of my day. A few pages, a short article, a story before sleep, nothing dramatic, but the expectation itself changed everything. Expectation prepares the brain. When your brain expects English, it stops resisting it. It switches modes faster, it wastes less energy. That is when thinking in English becomes natural, not forced. I noticed this during conversations. Someone would speak and I would understand the idea immediately. Not every word, not every detail, but the meaning arrived quickly. My brain did not panic when it missed something. It stayed inside the conversation. That stability is rare among learners, and it does not come from speaking more. It comes from exposure that feels safe. Reading had created that safety. Another change surprised me. My inner dialogue began shifting languages depending on context. When I thought about work, English appeared. When I planned messages, English arrived first. When I reflected on something I read, English stayed present. This did not happen because I tried to think in English. It happened because English had become familiar. Lesson 18. You do not force your brain to think in a language. You surround it until it chooses that language naturally. This realization changed how I approached learning completely. I stopped asking what technique would make me fluent faster. I started asking what environment would make English feel normal. Reading was the foundation of that environment. I also noticed how this affected my confidence. Not speaking confidence, mental confidence. I trusted my comprehension. I trusted my ability to follow ideas. That trust reduced fear before it appeared. Fear feeds on uncertainty. Reading removes uncertainty. When uncertainty drops, thinking speeds up. Another powerful shift happened in how I learned new words. I stopped memorizing them. I encountered them repeatedly in reading. They arrived with context, emotion, intention. My brain remembered them naturally. Lesson 19. Words learned through reading come with meaning attached. Words memorized arrive alone. That difference matters when speaking. Context-rich words appear faster. They feel usable. I also noticed that reading shaped how I structured ideas. English tends to move from clear to specific, from main point to detail, from conclusion to explanation. Without studying this consciously, my thinking began following that pattern. That is what people mean when they say someone thinks in English. It is not about language, it is about logic flow. Reading teaches logic flow. This changed how I spoke. My sentences became clearer, not longer, not advanced, just clearer. Clarity is the real sign of thinking in English. One evening I reflected on how strange the journey had been. I had chased speaking for years, but reading had quietly prepared my brain to speak better than forcing ever did. I realized something important. Speaking problems are often thinking problems. When your brain cannot process English quickly, speaking feels hard. When your brain processes English smoothly, speaking becomes manageable. Reading trains processing. If you understand English but feel slow, blocked, or tired when using it, your brain is overloaded. Reading reduces that load. It teaches your brain what English feels like when it works. I want to say this clearly. Reading is not a passive skill, it is a cognitive trainer. It trains attention, it trains prediction, it trains structure. And all of those are required for fluent thinking. If you've ever felt like English stays in your head but not in your mouth, reading is the bridge, not reading more, reading better. In the final segment, I will bring this journey to a close. I will explain what changes permanently once your brain begins thinking in English and how to protect this progress for the long term. Segment 8. Narrator Daniel. The final change did not arrive with excitement. It arrived with quiet certainty, the kind you only notice when you look back and realize something fundamental is no longer missing. English stopped feeling like something I entered. It became something I stayed inside. I noticed it one ordinary day. I was reading a short article, nothing difficult, nothing impressive. When I finished, I closed it and continued thinking about the idea. And only later did I realize something important. I was still thinking in English, not forcing it, not translating, not checking myself. The language stayed. That is when I understood what reading had really done. It had changed my default. For years, my brain treated English as a foreign mode, something it visited briefly, then escaped from. Reading turned English into a familiar environment, a place my brain could remain without effort. This is the real meaning of thinking in English. It is not constant, it is not perfect, it is comfortable. Comfort is what allows speed. Speed is what allows speech. When your brain feels comfortable, it stops overprotecting you. It stops slowing you down. It stops asking permission before responding. That is why speaking becomes easier after reading, even if you never practiced speaking directly. Reading removes friction. I also noticed something else. My fear changed. It did not disappear, but it stopped appearing at the beginning. It appeared later, if at all. Sometimes after the conversation, sometimes not at all. That timing mattered. Fear that arrives late has no power. This is what reading had done. It moved fear out of the decision-making phase. When fear is late, language wins. I no longer ask myself, can I say this correctly? I asked, what do I think? The answer came first, the language followed. That order matters. Thinking before language creates translation. Thinking through language creates fluency. Reading trains the second. I stopped worrying about losing progress because I understood something deeply. Reading creates a foundation that does not collapse easily. Even if I skipped a few days, even if I spoke less for a while, even if fear returned briefly, the base remained. This is why reading is different from techniques. Techniques fade when you stop using them, foundations remain. I also learned how to protect this change. I kept reading simple. I kept it daily. I kept it relaxed. The moment reading feels like pressure, the brain resists. The moment it feels normal, the brain absorbs. I stopped chasing fluency milestones. I stopped asking when I would be fluent. That question no longer mattered. What mattered was this: English worked. I could understand faster, I could think clearer, I could respond sooner. That was enough. If you are listening to this and still feel stuck, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not need to think harder in English, you need to make English easier for your brain. Reading does that quietly. Not by teaching rules, not by demanding output, but by showing your brain what English looks like when it works. 10 minutes a day, one idea at a time, no pressure. That is how brains change. That is how English becomes natural. And one day, without noticing the moment it happened, you will realize that English is no longer something you are trying to learn. It is something you are already using. Subscribe now. Join the Bright World English Academy family, and let's start your English learning journey together.